Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And in moving the Government's motion, I would like to thank all right honourable and honourable members for engaging in this very important debate now and throughout the passage of the bill. I'd particularly like to thank my honourable friends, the members for Kensington, Ipswich, Rochester and Strood, Wimbledon, and members across the House for the keen interest that they have shown in this matter. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'll keep my opening remarks short for now, as I know that many members are keen to contribute, and I shall wind up later on. But let me say in beginning, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the Government remains steadfast in its commitment to delivering the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 1 report's recommendations. This bill is an important first step to delivering those recommendations. The Government has always been clear that all residents should be safe and feel safe in their homes. That's why the Government will be providing an additional £3.5 billion to fund the removal and the replacement of unsafe cladding on residential buildings. And this will be targeted. I will give way to the honourable gentleman if he wishes to intervene on me later on, but let me conclude my remarks initially. This will be targeted on the highest risk buildings. That is to say, those buildings over 18 metres that have unsafe cladding. The scale of this investment should not be underestimated. Over £5 billion of taxpayers' money and more when the developer levy and the developer tax are taken into account. And we have an ambitious timescale to ensure remediation of unsafe cladding is completed at pace. We're also now seeing tangible progress from RICS revising their guidance on EWS1 forms, from lenders who commit to adhering to RICS guidance, and from more developers now allocating significant funds for remediation. Mr Deputy Speaker, as parliamentarians, we have a duty to implement a clear framework and transparent legislation to support fire and building safety reform. I'm afraid to say that despite the best intentions of these amendments, and I absolutely accept the sincerity with which they are posited, they are unworkable and impractical. They'll make legislation less clear. They do not reflect the complexity involved in apportioning liability for remedial defects. These amendments, and I may say I've had extensive conversations about the effects that the amendments might have with my honourable friend, the member for Rochester and Strood, who's pressed me hard on it, as have others. These amendments would also require extensive redrafting of primary legislation, resulting in delays to the commencement of the fire safety bill and delays to our overall programme. They could also have unintended and possibly perverse consequences for those that the amendments are intended to support, and we would still be no further forward resolving these issues. So I shall give way to the honourable gentleman when I return to speak later, but let me say in conclusion in my opening remarks, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we cannot accept these amendments and we encourage the House to vote against them and so for the government amendment.
The question is that this House disagrees with the Lords in their amendments 4B, 4C, 4D and 4E. Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased that so many members have put in to speak today, so I want to keep my remarks fairly brief, but I do want to make 3 points. The first one is, thank goodness, I am not standing at this dispatch box again and pleading with the government to agree, at the very least, a timetable to implement the vital fire safety measures from the first phase of the Grenfell inquiry. I am pleased that the government has agreed in the other place to Labour's suggestion of a timetable. Before the second anniversary of the Grenfell Phase 1 recommendations, the government has committed to regulations to implement them, and that will be by October this year. They said that this would delay the bill. They said that this would be too complicated. They said that this would be too hard to do, but they have now agreed to a version of it. It's not quite what we wanted, but it is something close. Mr Deputy Speaker, I've lost count of the number of times we have voted on the Grenfell recommendations, the number of times we've been pushed back, and it is quite extraordinary that the government has taken so long to get us here. Labour's previous amendment, which the government has now agreed to a timetable to deliver, would do 4 things. First, the owners of buildings that contain 2 or more sets of domestic premises would share information with their local fire and rescue service about the design and makeup of the external walls. They would complete regular inspections of fire entrance doors. They'd complete regular inspections of lifts, and they would share evacuation and fire safety instructions with residents and the fire service. These measures were straightforward and supported by key stakeholders. In the Minister's letter that sets out details of the government's concession, he wrote that they will lay regulations to make responsible persons produce and regularly review evacuation plans for their building. The Grenfell recommendation and our amendment said more than that, that they should also be shared with local fire and rescue services and residents. So I would like the Minister to clarify, if he could, in his closing remarks, who these evacuation plans will be shared with and how this will be enforced. But I'm grateful to the Minister for seeing sense and heeding our calls to do the right thing, because, Mr Deputy Speaker, it has been ages. So I come to the second point I want to make. It has been now nearly 4 years since 72 people so tragically lost their lives in the Grenfell Tower fire. And in those 4 years, Grenfell United, the families, survivors and the entire community has fought tirelessly for change. It is thanks to their hard work and their dedication that the government has finally agreed to implement the recommendations by October 2021. So I want to pay tribute to them and their ongoing fight for justice. And I want to pay tribute to our firefighters who keep us safe every day. We know that cuts to their service have hit hard, response times inevitably are affected, morale is affected, and now they have a pay freeze. No way to thank them for going above and beyond in COVID. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I come to my third and final point. Leaseholders should not have to fund the costs of fire safety remediation works when they are not to blame and they are the least able to pay. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I completely and wholeheartedly agree with her on that point, as she well knows, because the leaseholders are affected in my own constituency. But as she will know, leaseholders in Wales have been left in the dark, whilst the Welsh Government's put forward additional monies, 32 million in their new budget on this very issue. They're still in the dark about the government's announcements, what monies there will be for Wales and how the levy and tax will work. Doesn't she agree that the government should sit down with the Welsh Government Housing Minister and sort this out for the benefit of all leaseholders?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I have a sense of déjà vu, because we have been saying this for some time. We have been saying all of this for some time, as have members across the House. And of course the government should sit down with the Welsh Government and work out how, if any, of this funding is going to go to Wales and how it's going to work. Today, Mr Deputy Speaker, is a chance... Okay, I will give way before I talk.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and she's indeed making a very powerful point about the needs of leaseholders. Will she agree with me that it's also vital, as well as dealing with the gaps in the remaining in the support so far announced, that there is much more clarity in what leaseholders should be entitled to, particularly those in shared ownership arrangements where there can be variety of the quality of work done and relationship with their social landlord. And that is causing great confusion, great anxiety, and indeed great difficulty in whether or not they can sell their properties as well.
Thank you. Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point, and the plight of people who are in shared ownership properties is dire and needs to be looked at by this government, as does the plight of many thousands of people who are still trapped in unsafe buildings or buildings they cannot sell, or who face extortionate bills for remediation work, or who face huge increases in insurance and waking watch costs and other costs that they simply cannot afford. Mr Deputy Speaker, people are going bankrupt. We can't feel it in this place, but every time we have a debate on this issue, every time we have a vote, thousands of people write to all of us and say, we are hoping against hope that you do the right thing this time. We have people writing with heartfelt pleas. Their stories are stark. And every time we have this debate, every time we have this conversation, people's hopes are raised, and there is this groundswell on social media and in our inbox of people saying, maybe now the government is going to do the right thing, and they're watching us now, hoping that we're going to do the right thing. And it is very sad that the government is indicating at the moment that they are not going to take this issue seriously. It is taking a heavy toll on people's mental health and is putting millions of lives on hold. Leaseholders have been trapped in this impossible position for too long. We have continually, throughout the passage of the bill, campaigned on this issue, and we welcome the latest amendment from the Bishop of St Albans. Like Labour's previous amendments, like amendments from members in this House on both sides, this amendment would prohibit the cost of replacing unsafe cladding to be passed on to leaseholders or tenants. In February, the Housing Secretary told thousands of people across the country that they will be locked into years of debt to fix fire safety problems which were not their fault. And we hear that the government has decided to lay a motion to disagree with the Bishop of St Albans' amendment. This is a direct and deliberate betrayal of the promise that ministers have made over 17 times that leaseholders should not be left to foot the bill. Over the weekend, I wrote to members of Parliament from across the House who have constituents affected, urging them to back the amendments. And I sincerely hope that together we will stand up for the rights of leaseholders today, and all members will do the right thing. The risk of fire and looming bankruptcy will not wait while the government delays with inaction and failed proposals to keep leaseholders out of debt. Today is another chance for the government to finally put the public safety first and bring forward legislation to protect leaseholders from the unfair, deeply unfair situation of paying their fire safety repairs that they are not responsible for. Members across this House are united on this issue and are determined that innocent leaseholders should not foot the bill. Today should be the day where people across the country can go to sleep with a great sense of relief that the government has listened and put into law protections for leaseholders. So I sincerely hope that the Minister will change his mind. It is not too late for the government to do the right thing and protect innocent leaseholders across the country. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a 3-minute limit that's being imposed now on all contributions, and apologies for those members who are on the call list and just simply won't get in because there won't be enough time. Sir Peter Bottomley.
There isn't time to say what the government has done for leaseholders. It's right, I think, to say that the fire safety bill, in the form the government want to return it to, if they get the House to reject the Lord's amendments, will place an automatic, unchallengeable financial burden on residential leaseholders in building safety remediation costs, even in circumstances where a lease may have excluded that obligation. I would incidentally refer the Minister, if he has time, to look at the article by Martina Lees in the Sunday Times Home section about some of the building costs which aren't justified. Returning to the Bishop's amendments, they're intended to protect leaseholders from being solely responsible for these costs. The bill strengthens the landlord of freeholders' legal right over leaseholders. The amendments provide for more balanced liability for costs, and these Lord's amendments should not be overturned. The alternative, which the government is asking us to do, wrongly and disproportionately disadvantages innocent leaseholders. Many are unable to pay, and they are frightened. This is a Home Office bill. The Home Secretary, in her reason for rejecting previous Lord's Amendment 4, because she said, the issue of remediation costs is too complex to be dealt with in the manner proposed. I say, and I think people on both sides agree, and probably the Minister does privately, that what's being proposed can't be supported. It's too simple that it loads costs on leaseholders, who are the only people who cannot be responsible for putting right a building they don't own, that they will never own, that their legal terms are only tenants of. I ask the Minister, if he can, ask his colleagues to let him agree to accept these Lord's amendments, let the leaseholders free.
Peter Link. Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Could I say, first of all, that I support the Lords in the message they sent back. The reality is that the Lords are proposing very important changes to the government's position. First of all, and it isn't just leaseholders who shouldn't have to pay, it's tenants. For example, in a block where the social housing provider is the freeholder, then in that block, leaseholders, according to the government's proposals, would not have to pay, but tenants who are there as social housing tenants, if it isn't ACM cladding that's been removed, would have to pay themselves through their rents for the removal of cladding. That disparity simply cannot be right, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that tenants have to pay and leaseholders don't. But leaseholders, of course, in blocks under the 18-metre rule will face costs that we're not quite sure of, because the government are bringing this loan scheme in, and it's still an awful lot of vagueness and lack of clarity about what the loan scheme will actually mean. When the Building Safety Minister came to our select committee recently, he said that leaseholders wouldn't be responsible for paying the loan, but neither would freeholders. The charge would be on the building. Mr. Deputy Speaker, a building can't be legally responsible for a charge for a loan placed on it. Some organisation, some individual has to be responsible. Is it the freeholder? Is it the leaseholder? Awful lot of unclarity about that, and how you limit leaseholders' charges to £50 a month. A great deal of confusion. The government are still working that through, so as things stand, there can't be an absolute assurance that leaseholders won't have to pay on the blocks under 18 metres. Then finally, of course, are the issues other than cladding. It's not just cladding that's going to have to be taken off, and very often in some blocks of flats, the cost of doing other fire safety work is greater. Again, what we were told was that if the other work is associated with the removal of cladding, then it will be covered by the government's financial help. So if insulation was a composite part of the building structure along with the cladding, then presumably the other work, the insulation, could be removed as it's an association with the cladding. However, if the insulation was completely separate and distinct from the cladding, then the government's funding might pay for the cladding removal, but it wouldn't pay for the insulation removal. And very often leaseholders simply can't afford to pay for that, and the government won't allow any of the scheme to go ahead, any of their funding to go ahead, unless the leaseholders can find the additional costs. None of these positions are acceptable, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I support a position where leaseholders nor tenants are asked to pay for making their buildings fire safe.
Video link. Stephen McPartland.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to start by thanking the Lord Bishop of St Albans and the Lord Bishop of London for ensuring that we have the opportunity to vote on the amendments today. It provides us with the chance to actually divide the House on whether or not leaseholders should be responsible for paying for historic fire safety costs. I would urge the Minister and urge the government to accept the amendment, or if there's something wrong with it, table their own amendment to work with us, work with leaseholders to try and resolve this issue. It's unacceptable that people feel that we want taxpayers to pay. Leaseholders don't want taxpayers to pay. Members across the House don't want taxpayers to pay. We want those responsible to pay, the developers, the insurance companies, the building regulators who said that these properties were safe over the last 20 to 30 years. When many of the leaseholders who are going to be forced to pay these bills were in primary school and not even born. It's not acceptable. It's not fair. It's not right. What we're doing today is shameful. The amendment keeps the status quo in regards to the costs of remediation. I understand the Minister's point that this bill is a small bill and it's not the right area to deal with the costs of remediation. I agree with the Minister. But it's the Minister and it's his bill that is actually transferring the liability in this bill across to leaseholders. The current status quo is that leaseholders are not responsible for the costs for anything to do with external walls or doors. It's this bill which is amending the legislation. It's this bill which is ensuring that leaseholders are responsible for paying for historic fire safety defects. It's not fair. I was at a building today, and it became very clear very quickly that the estimated costs of remediation are actually more than the cost and the value of the properties within it. So I say to the Minister, can he give me an answer? What will happen in the case where the costs of remediation are more than the value of the building itself and the properties within it? Will that building be written off like an insurance company would write off a car? Will those people be made homeless? We certainly know that if this bill goes through, even more leaseholders are going to face bankruptcy. Even more leaseholders are going to face huge issues around homelessness. Interim costs at the moment are bankrupting leaseholders up and down the country. Leaseholders are screaming for help. They're screaming in pain. And what are we doing? Today, we're saying to them, thanks for paying the interim costs. Once you've finished that, we're now going to load you up with remediation costs on top. Tens of thousands of pounds that people just don't have the funds for. We're nearly 4 years on from Grenfell, and it appears to me that the government has given up on those who should be responsible for paying and just pushing the cost onto leaseholders. It's morally unacceptable.
Lydia Lane. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I will be supporting the amendment moved by the Bishop of St Albans, because in circumstances where leaseholders are beset by worry, fear and uncertainty, it will provide them with the reassurance that they won't have to pay to fix a problem they're not responsible for. And it will also make the government realise they're going to have to come forward with a different solution. There are two problems here. Firstly, dangerous cladding, and secondly, other fire safety defects that have been discovered in building after building. The government appears to be in the position now where the funding it's announced will pay for the remediation of missing fire cavity barriers where they are integral to the replacement of dangerous cladding, but not where they aren't. In other words, where they're elsewhere in the building. I don't really understand this. And could the Minister say whether, if the works that the government is prepared to fund through the scheme are completed, the buildings in question will be declared safe so that the Waking Watch and insurance costs disappear, even if the other fire safety defects have not been fixed? Time, however, is not on our side, because we know how long making all of these homes safe is going to take, even if all the necessary funding had already been identified. Why? Because there's detailed inspections to be done, tenders have to be put together, firms found willing to do the work, scaffolding, building materials have to be ordered before the work could even begin. And given the scale of this, it is going to take a long time. But that's the one thing that leaseholders do not have, because, as we've heard, they are paying bills that they cannot afford. And even worse, the bills are now starting to arrive on the doormats demanding payment to fix the cladding. One recent example was a demand for £71,000. It might as well be for £1 million, because there is no prospect of leaseholders being able to find that kind of money. And so the longer this goes on, the more likely we are to see leaseholders becoming bankrupt. What are the local authorities going to do when they turn up at their door and say, I'm homeless, I need somewhere to stay? And make no mistake, the anger that leaseholders are feeling at the moment will be something else again when they find themselves being made homeless through no fault of their own. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, let us do the right thing today to protect leaseholders, and then the government can turn its attention to finding an answer that will actually work. And at a time when people are getting bills to the tune, as I've just said, of £71,000 through the letterbox, to stand up and say, I'm really sorry, but this isn't the right bill, I think demonstrates a failure to understand the nightmare that so many of the people we represent are living through. Thank you.
Thank you. I will be calling the Minister to wind up the debate at 5 to 9. Royston Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, may I also put my thanks on record to the Lord Bishop of St Albans and the Bishop of London, without whom this amendment wouldn't be back here tonight. Mr. Deputy Speaker, not to try and outdo the Honourable Member for Leeds Central, but in my hand this evening I have an invoice. It's an invoice for service charges and remediation of fire safety defects. Mr. Deputy Speaker, is an invoice for nearly £79,000. Imagine for one moment you're trapped in a flat you've been told is unsafe. Night after night you go to bed with the fear of fire. You can't sell your flat because it's worthless. Everyone knows none of this is your fault, and then an envelope drops through your letterbox. When you open it, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is a bill for £78,000 to put defects right that are not of your making. I'm asking members across the House to vote to agree with the Lord's amendment, the Bishop of St Albans amendment tonight, better known or formerly known as the McPartland-Smith amendment to the Fire Safety Bill. I'm asking them to vote with us tonight because bills like this one have already started to arrive and they're not going to stop, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Everyone knows what is happening, and if they don't, they should open their own emails and they should read the heartbreaking experiences of their constituents. This is not politics, it's not ideology. In fact, I don't know what it is. But is it any wonder that some leaseholders feel that there's some sort of conspiracy against them? Mr. Deputy Speaker, are we going to let the innocent continue to pick up the tab for the guilty? What are we doing about the developers, the contractors and the manufacturers? What are we doing about the insurers and NHBC? What are we doing about local authority development control and others that signed off these buildings as safe? Are they sleeping soundly in their beds tonight? Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is an economic reason for voting for the amendment, and there is a political reason for voting for it. But beyond that, there is a moral reason. If this bill becomes law, we will be abandoning hundreds of thousands of innocent people, and I'm not going to have that on my conscience.
Video link. Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak this evening. I've been contacted by and met with hundreds of concerned constituents, many of whom are trapped in unsafe leasehold properties. I have also met with Cladding, a group set up to ensure the voices of disabled leaseholders are heard, and I hope the Minister will also meet with them. Many of those I have spoken to bought their first homes through government schemes they believed would help rather than hinder them. They now wish to move on, but are instead facing bankruptcy due to astronomical bills. Understandably, they want to know why those who should be taking responsibility are not doing so. Take, for example, Berkeley Homes and its subsidiary, St James. Unlike other developers and housing providers in the constituency, the CEO of Berkeley Homes has refused 3 times to attend public meetings I have organised or to answer leaseholders' reasonable questions about remediation costs. The company remains in dispute with the owners of Aragon Tower in Deptford and whether the fire breaks in the building are faulty. Meanwhile, over 160 residents are fearful of what might happen while they are asleep. The stress of paying for remedial works is particularly acute for leaseholders in shared ownership blocks, including Norfolk House in Deptford. Residents do not qualify for the government's new cladding grants as their building is under 18 metres. They are therefore faced with having to pay back costs at £50 per month. The estimated total for removing the cladding is £3 million, meaning that residents would have this debt hanging over their heads for many years to come. On top of this, they are facing additional fire safety charges, including for a waking watch. The cost of this, to be billed from September, is a staggering £74,000 per month. Many constituents are also finding that banks will not lend on properties without external wall survey certificates, despite government advice that the document is not a legal requirement. Just as the country faces another financial crisis, leaseholders will be forced into higher mortgage rates for homes which in many cases are no longer suited for their needs. The FCA merely suggests using mortgage intermediaries. Ministers promised on at least 15 occasions that cladding costs would not be passed on to leaseholders, yet for years they have failed to deliver. Tonight I'm calling on the government to support those amendments which would absolve leaseholders of bearing the cost of a crisis which is not of their making.
Video link. Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Nearly 4 years after Grenfell, and it's very disappointing that the government still hasn't finalised support to make people's homes safe, and that leaseholders are still waiting for the protection ministers have promised multiple times, and that the Lord's amendments could help deliver. I'm in touch with over 3,000 households affected in my constituency, and hundreds of leaseholders have completed my online survey. People left in limbo by government but facing higher costs already in service charges or wake-in watches. People left facing costs but an uncertain timeline for work. 7 in 10 who've completed my survey said that works have been identified as necessary but are yet to get the date for repairs. Also seeing people that government deliberately excluded from help with compartmentalisation safety measures or living in buildings less than 80 metres tall. I'm working with people living in 28 such buildings already. And people who've seen delays in government action, despite the government being at fault in failing to ensure previous regulations meant house building and renovations were safe. And of course, I'm dealing with people who've seen problems caused by the government guidance needlessly affecting their insurance or mortgage. Today, I'm supporting Lord's amendments, but I'm also asking the government not to profiteer from this situation. In line with VAT changes made 3 years ago for some new builds, I'm seeking, with cross-party back, including the Honourable Member of Southampton Itchen, who's already spoken, a VAT exemption on essential works required through fire safety surveys. If adopted, the government's own Building Safety Fund would go 20% further without VAT being lost for what are not luxury changes, but essential remedial works required by government to make people's homes safe. Put simply, we can't go from dishy-rishy eating out to help out last year to rip-off rishy profiteering from people's misery today. So I hope this cross-party request will gain further support and that ministers will meet campaigners on this specific issue.
Thank you very much. Video link. Bob Blackman.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and a pleasure to follow the member for Bermondsey and Old Southwark. The issue that we have before us tonight is, of course, that the government have moved very swiftly to try and remediate the cladding on tall buildings. That has been slow progress, but now progress is being made. However, for medium-rise buildings, those below 6 stories, we know that leaseholders will have to bear a cost, but we don't know what that cost will be. We don't know the results of the proposals for the loan scheme as yet, and it's quite clear that the government are trying to find a way forward, but at the moment we are yet to see the details. At the same time, we have the issue of fire safety in buildings. This fire safety bill is vital to preserve fire safety across the country in all buildings of all structures. The results of the Grenfell inquiry have demonstrated and lifted the lid on the scandal that we have had of the tall buildings that have been erected in this country without proper fire safety regulations. The principal problem, however, comes that once a survey is carried out of that building, we'll know the extent to which work is required, whether regulations were followed when the building was put up, or indeed whether the materials used within that building were correct or not. The reality is that the people that provided those materials, if they were substandard, should be made to replace them free of charge. If the builders put them up without following the proper regulations, then we should go back to them to make sure that they are required to carry out the remediation. The one set of people who are completely and utterly innocent are the leaseholders. They didn't build the building. They bought their leases on the belief that the building was safe and secure. So the reality is that we should send out the strongest signal tonight that leaseholders should not have to pay a penny piece towards the cost of remedying things that were not their fault in the first place. Now, the Minister may say that this is the wrong place to put this, but the Building Safety Bill will take at least 18 months to possibly 2 years to bring to fruition. Leaseholders do not have the time to wait for us to deliberate. So let us join together and send the signal that leaseholders do not have to pay a penny. If the government believe that there's somehow the amendment is flawed, let the government come forward with an amendment that is satisfactory and will result in the key issue, which is not requiring leaseholders to pay.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm really pleased to see this bill back before us, and I'm proud that it was the amendment that I tabled at committee stage in June of last year that introduced this principle into the bill for the first time, that leaseholders must be protected from the extortionate costs of fire safety remediation. And I'm very grateful to my noble friend Baroness Pinnock for taking this idea up in the other place, and to the honourable members for Stevenage and Southampton and the Lord Bishops of St Albans and London for improving it along the way. The arguments for and against protecting leaseholders in the fire safety bill are now well established. The government continues to attempt to fob us off with the inadequate and flawed remediation fund. Fire safety experts have debunked the fund's arbitrary 18-metre cut-off. Meanwhile, leaseholders keep trying in vain to tell the government that it is not just cladding. Buildings of any height would still be left liable for non-cladding remediation of missing fire breaks, flammable balconies, dangerous insulation, as well as having to pay for waking watchers and additional alarms. I have listened with interest as ministers continue to reject this amendment. We hear time and time again that it is not sufficiently detailed. It will require substantial drafting of primary legislation. It could cause litigation, delay remediation work, and have unintended consequences. That's a new one. The government claims that it is the members who back this amendment who are apparently responsible for causing delays to this bill. When, Mr Deputy Speaker, it is the government that has taken almost 4 years to bring forward a 2-page bill. Not once, Mr Deputy Speaker, not once has the government acknowledged the risks of this bill going through without this amendment. Not once has the government addressed the fact that financial costs will be incurred by leaseholders from day one if this bill goes through without this amendment. Mr Deputy Speaker, the government has spent 9 months finding fault with this amendment, but at no point has it brought forward their own. Leaseholders cannot rely on the flawed Building Safety Fund, nor can they wait any longer for promises of hope in a building safety bill that may or may not help in the future. Ministers can see the strength of feeling in this House, even from their own benches, and they can hear the pleas from millions of desperate homeowners. This amendment may not be perfect, but it is the only proposal on the table to protect leaseholders from the financial repercussions of fire safety defects that are not of their making. I call on all members to do the right thing and support it.
Dr. Lam Fox.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I understand why the government won't accept this amendment, and I don't want to go there again. But what we do need is urgency. Time is not just money, although it is money. It is also worry, anxiety and uncertainty. I want to just echo some of the points made in one of the many excellent letters I've had from my constituents in Portishead on this. They say it is not right that leaseholders have to worry about the costs of fixing safety defects that we did not cause. We all agree with that. The question is, who should pay? I believe that if it's a direct result of legislative change made by the government, that it's reasonable that taxpayers would be contributing to that. If it's not, then it's builders and insurers who should pay, including for non-cladding related defects. The second point that they make is we recognise that the additional £3.5 billion announced by the Secretary of State is a step forward, and we do welcome this funding. We're still awaiting the full detail of this funding announcement, as well as that of the proposed loan scheme for medium-rise buildings. And at the last debate, Mr Deputy Speaker, we were told that more details would be forthcoming after the budget. Well, we are after the budget, and we've still not had the details that we're looking for. And the point is that these are real-time problems that require real-time solutions on behalf of our constituents. They then go on to say that providing funding for buildings over 18 metres while forcing leaseholders in buildings under 18 metres to pay via a loan scheme is entirely unfair because building height alone does not determine fire risk. We understand that, and again, it's about appreciating that there needs to be a cut-off to stop taxpayers having to sign a blank cheque. But the costs should be met for remediation by those who are actually responsible for the problems being there in the first place. And the final problem that they raise, as has been raised so often in this debate and the previous debates we've had, is around negative equity. Negative equity and the difficulty in resale is causing immense distress. It can be a major generational problem, and for people who are looking to sell, to downsize, for example, it can cause them a great deal of anxiety. And, of course, we've heard, as we would normally expect, that the market should sort it out. But we're still waiting for elements that the market would normally regard as the necessary parts of that to be made available to us. I won't, because time is very short and so many members want to try to get in. I apologise to my right honourable friend. Last time I asked what direct contacts ministers had with the Association of British Insurers, with the building societies and the banks, because without their help we're unable to deal with this negative equity and resale problem, which is at the heart of so much of the distress that we're finding. Mr Deputy Speaker, I know from talking to so many of my constituents on this, they appreciate that the government has already come a long way. They're very grateful for taxpayer support. The problem is that we need more details, and in real-time issues, we need real-time solutions. Urgency is the key.
Billy Link. Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to colleagues in the other place for the opportunity to reconsider amending this bill. I'd also like to thank the honourable members for Stevenage and Southampton Itchen for their perseverance in holding the government to account on this cladding scandal. Mr Deputy Speaker, much has been said in this chamber about why leaseholders should be protected from fire safety remediation costs. And I could repeat the long list of powerful arguments that myself and colleagues from across the House have put to the government. But instead, I want to draw on the experiences of those whose voices are not often heard in this debate, and in particular, the problems faced by disabled leaseholders. And I pay tribute to the work of the Disabled Leaseholders Disability Action Group in highlighting this. For many disabled constituents in Vauxhall, the difficulties of finding accessible homes in London means that where possible, they choose to invest in a property that is viewed as a potential property for life. And in many instances, shared ownership with a housing association is an affordable option for those who don't have enough savings for a large deposit or even a mortgage. Many disabled leaseholders would have spent thousands of pounds adapting their flats to suit their needs, including bathrooms, kitchen adaptations, with these often being funded through local authority disabled grants. But like so many leaseholders caught up in this crisis, they are now facing an additional burden of remediation costs on top of other fire safety measures, putting them at risk of bankruptcy and losing their home for life. What's more, we know that disabled people are less likely to have savings and to meet these income and to meet the unforeseen bills. And these are all means tested. This cannot be right. The important amendment before us this evening would help to end this nightmare for all leaseholders. And so I urge all colleagues across the House to join me in voting for it today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Video link. Shabana Mahmood.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. There is a simple question for the House to consider today. Should leaseholders be forced to pay for essential remediation works that they are compelled to undertake to their properties which have come about through no fault of their own? The only possible answer to this question is no. We know that the cladding calamity that has befallen so many of our constituents did not come about because leaseholders have failed in any way. All of the costs that are attributable to the cladding scandal are down to the failures by developers and by successive governments who have presided over shocking, scandalous regulatory failure that has pushed thousands of wholly innocent people to the brink of financial ruin. We all know that the costs of this regulatory failure that has created this crisis are in the many billions of pounds, but they must not fall on the ordinary people who are not responsible for this mess. There are other ways, I believe, by which the government can raise the necessary money. I believe they should bring forward a levy on developers and the construction industry to fund the costs of remediation of both cladding removal as well as remediating the many other fire risks that many of us in the House have been raising now for quite some time. And I think that the government should also strengthen regulations on procurement so that local authorities and metro mayors can prevent developers and construction companies who are failing to live up to their moral obligations in putting right the fire hazards that they are responsible for creating from bidding for any further publicly funded development contracts. In this way, we can reward those who are doing the right thing and putting right the issues in relation to cladding in the buildings that they were responsible for putting up, and hopefully force a rethink on the part of those who are failing to live up to their responsibilities by preventing them from bidding for further taxpayer-funded contracts. But what is clear, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that the government must not pin the spiralling costs of this crisis on the ordinary people who are currently facing financial ruination. I urge all members to support and keep in the bill the amendment made by the Bishop of St Albans, because to do anything else is a dereliction of our duty, and this House must do the right thing by leaseholders this evening.
Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I must draw the House's attention, first of all, to my entry in the Register of Members' Interests. I think the first thing to say is I agree with many of the comments that we've made. It simply cannot be right that leaseholders are faced with bills of tens of thousands of pounds. Nevertheless, I cannot support this amendment because I don't think it's effective. A number of reasons. Number one, it seems to put somebody on the hook, an indeterminate person on the hook, for fire safety remediation forever. It is not limited to historic defects as I read it. I don't think I should because of the timescales involved. Well, as an author of the amendment. Yes.
I'm very grateful for giving way. It's because I want to ask this simple question, and I'm sure you'll appreciate it, and that is, we've been back here 3 or 4 times now to discuss this over and over, and every time I've said, if it's defective, then take it, make it work, and have it as your own. Would my honourable friend agree that that's the way to go?
Well, as I said to him after the last debate, I offered the opportunity to sit down with him and look at an amendment that might work in concert with the government. I think the other difficulty of this amendment, if this puts the onus right back on the freeholders of a building. Now, many people would say that's fine, that's better than the leaseholders having that responsibility. I don't think that it puts the leaseholders in a better situation, because the freeholder would simply hand back, simply close down a company, hand back the responsibility, would fall back on the leaseholders once again. I simply don't think the amendment works. A couple of general comments I would say about this. I have, as a former member of the Select Committee at the time of the Grenfell tragedy, the first thing we campaigned for straight away at that point, like many people across this House, was a complete ban on combustible cladding. And that's exactly what the government stepped in to do, of course, and that's a prospective, of course, but left a retrospective issue. And clearly the government has stepped in for cladding on the retrospective issue on high-risk buildings, which is exactly what the Select Committee was campaigning for. 1,700 buildings, high-risk, over 18 metres, and that's what the $5 billion of funding does remediate. Now, many people in this debate have said, well, what about the other elements, the missing fire breaks and other elements? It's absolutely right, of course, that you can't expect leaseholders to take on a debt of tens of thousands of pounds. That's simply not right. What we need to do is take a risk-based approach to this. There are lots of buildings, particularly lower-rise buildings, that can be safely remediated without necessarily replacing cladding. There are sprinklers, there are fire alarms, there are other systems that make that building just as safe. What I think we need to do is form a coalition of people right across the sector, be it building owners, be it contractors, be it building managers, be it manufacturers, to find the best risk-based solution to this problem, minimise the cost on anybody, not least the leaseholders. Of course, developers should pay. Of course they should. What we're talking about, and in many cases they have. Persimmon just put £70 million to one side to remediate some of their buildings. But of course, the difficulty here is we're often trying to deal with developers that are no longer there. I think the levy the government's brought forward is absolutely the right solution. I would urge you to extend the levy to materials manufacturers, particularly insulation manufacturers, which I feel are principally responsible for the scandal we are situated in now. In terms of leaseholders, of course, we don't want to see anybody go bankrupt as a result of these costs. Clearly, there is a cap on costs for lower-rise buildings. It may well be that there should be a cap on costs for any leaseholder in any building to remediate these issues, and that's what I think we should look at. And also in terms of insurance as a way of government top-slicing the risk to make the insurance costs much lower. There are solutions here. It requires us all to work together to provide those solutions.
To resume his seat at 8:55 or before, Sir Robert Neill.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I have great respect for my honourable friend, the member for Thurston Moreton, his expertise in this area. I accept that this is not a perfect amendment at all. But it's the only thing that's available at the moment to keep the issue still in play. And that's why, unfortunately, I can't support the government tonight. Because at the end of the day, I had hoped we would have had a solution by now. The simple point is really this, isn't it? Whoever is at fault, and there may be a number of people in this, and it's happened over a period of time, the people who are not at fault are leaseholders who bought in good faith upon reliance on surveys and regulations which appeared to suggest that their properties were in order and they had no reason to think otherwise. It can't be right, therefore, that they are out of pocket, regardless of the height of the building. And whilst I quite understand that there may be perfectly good reasons for using 18 metres as a threshold of risk for prioritising work, it's not anything that has any relevance to responsibility, moral or otherwise, and therefore it's an arbitrary cut-off point there. And I hoped that the ministers would have taken the opportunity between the last debate and this to come up with a further scheme. I'd urge my right honourable friend, who I know is trying to do the right thing, and I know has put a great deal of money into this, to continue to think again and work urgently at this, because as my right honourable friend, the member for North Somerset, said, time is pressing. The one people who do not have the cash flow are the leaseholders. By all means go after those at fault, be they builders, developers, contractors. But in the meantime, we cannot leave leaseholders who have done nothing wrong facing bankruptcy because they're effectively in negative equity, having to fork out for a significant amount of costs, as are my constituents at North Point in Bromley, which is destroying people's lives. None of us want to do that. I know the government doesn't want to do that. But to find a solution, we have to cover the cost for those people who are not in a position to fund it over the length of time it will take between this bill imposing a liability upon them and the fire and the building safety bill coming along, as has been said, in perhaps 18 months, 12 months or best, down the track. It's covering that gap that needs to be done, and that gap has to be covered in a way in which all leaseholders are treated and protected equitably, regardless of the height of the building. So I do hope the government will use the opportunity of this, going back to the other House, to think again, to urgently crystallise a solution that we can all join around. Because I think the intentions are the same across this House, but we have to have something which does not leave leaseholders, those who are not at fault, exposed. It's not a question of caveat emptor. They relied upon professional advice and assurances. They are not the ones at fault. Be it loan or grant, either way, they should not be picking up the tab for something which was not ultimately their responsibility.
Yeah. Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to all right honourable and honourable members across the House for their contributions in this debate. Members have spoken passionately and sincerely on behalf of their constituents. And I think everybody across the House, on all sides of the House, wants to see the cladding scandal ended once and for all, and ended quickly, which is what the government is about. And as I didn't give way to him before, I suppose it would be only right for me now to give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Minister. He's been very generous. He kindly agreed the other day to speak with his ministerial colleagues about getting a sit-down meeting with the Welsh Housing Minister, Julie James, to resolve some of these unanswered issues. She did write on the 10th of February to the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. She is yet to receive a reply. Can we please get that meeting, or can we please get some answers to her very reasonable questions on behalf of leaseholders in Wales?
Mr. Speaker, not only did the honourable gentleman speak to me in the chamber, he also spoke to me, even more importantly, in the tea room, and I shall certainly ensure that he gets a response as swiftly as possible. Let me, in the time that I have, Mr. Deputy Speaker, speak to the effectiveness of this amendment, because as parliamentarians, no matter what the matter is before us, we have a duty, as I said earlier, to implement a clear framework, transparent legislation to support fire and building safety reform. And despite the best intentions of those who have tabled this amendment, I have to say that it is unworkable, that it is impracticable. And there are three specific points that I should raise. The first is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the amendment does not take into account remedial works that arise outside of the fire risk assessment process. For example, costs identified as a result of a safety incident or building works taking place. In such cases, this will not prevent costs being passed on, so it doesn't deliver what members want it to do. Furthermore, if these amendments were to be added to the bill and become law without the necessary redrafting of the legislation, then the government and thereby the taxpayer would in all likelihood fall liable to protracted action by building owners in the courts. Building owners could use litigation to claim for costs they feel are entitled to be pursued from leaseholders. And while that litigation is ongoing, there could be further delays to construction work carried out on urgent remediation. It could be a waste of time and a waste of taxpayers' money. Redrafting the bill is not something that can be done at the stroke of a pen. It requires parliamentary counsel and parliamentary draftsmen to work at it to make sure that any changes are sound, that any secondary legislation is also prepared so the government and thereby the taxpayer can avoid legal challenge. We wouldn't be able to get it done, I don't think, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in this session, nor do the amendments reflect the complexity involved in apportioning liability for remedial defects. The government has announced how it will distribute costs, including from developers and industry, through our upcoming levy and tax. But a decision through this amendment to pass all these costs to the building owner would be overly simplistic, and it could be counterproductive. It would be self-defeating, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if landlords faced with remediation costs simply walked away. And many could just do that. They could activate an insolvency procedure and just walk away. And that's not about protecting freeholders, it's about protecting leaseholders. It's about their position. Because if these leaseholders are left behind as the owners walk away, they'd be in the same position as they are now, with no certainty on how works will be paid for or when they will be done. There's a real risk that this amendment could actually make the problem worse for leaseholders. We'd be left in a situation where there would be delays to the commencement of the fire safety bill, delays to our wider building safety programme, greater uncertainty for leaseholders, and quite possibly unintended and deleterious consequences for them. We wouldn't be any further forward in resolving this issue. Briefly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have been working hard to ensure that those with broadest shoulders and those that should pay do pay. That's why my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, at the budget announced that there will be a levy on tall buildings and that there will be a tax on the sector. We do not want to absolve the industry of its responsibility. We're finalising how the levy will be calculated, and the Treasury are leading on the development of the tax. Of course, we want to make sure that it works effectively, that small and medium-sized developers are not unfairly disadvantaged. We want to get it right. We want to get it done as quickly as we can. I'm encouraged also, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that we are now seeing developers step forward in this effort by putting aside significant funding. Taylor Wimpey has put aside £125 million of funds to declad the buildings for which they are responsible. Persimmon, as my honourable friend, the member for Thirsk, mentioned, has put aside £75 million and is committed to pay all ACM and non-ACM remediation and inherent defects in the buildings for which they are responsible. So the sector is now stepping forward. We will encourage more to do so. We will bring forward the workings of the financial support scheme that we announced also at the budget to ensure that leaseholders in buildings below 18 metres only have to pay no more than £50 a month. We'll bring forward that information as soon as we possibly can, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in closing, this has been a crucial debate.